So it's a big money division and a lot of attention in this division. And we'll start with Alabama, 11-2 for the Crimson Tide, 6-2 in conference. Losses to Tennessee and LSU last year, both of them on the road, and a victory over Kansas State in the Sugar Bowl. And Lucas, like I mentioned a few minutes ago, you lose Bryce Young, number one pick in the draft. You lose Will Anderson, the number three pick in the draft. Will Anderson was responsible for 25% of Alabama's total pressures on defense last year. And then you lose Jahmyr Gibbs, who was the second running back taken, a top 12 pick. We had talked about over the summer, last year kind of felt like the year for Alabama when you had Bryce Young coming off a Heisman Trophy and you brought in Jahmyr Gibbs, a high-profile transfer. You had Will Anderson back on defense. And I think this year, it's a lot of questions for Alabama. It's questions at wide receiver. It's questions at quarterback. And it's questions on how do you replace one of the better defensive players in school history in Will Anderson. So how do you see the Crimson Tide? It feels like you're an Alabama native now. You're always in Birmingham, and you're in Tuscaloosa last week. So what are your thoughts on the Crimson Tide this year?
Yeah, they were really, really interesting when I was doing this write up because you had mentioned last year they look like by most standards maybe the go ahead national title contender going into last year. They don't even make the playoff, and you look at the roster this year. This feels like more of like a rebuilding. I know that's not really a thing Alabama does; they just reload. But there's a lot of question marks on this roster, more than I can remember in a long time covering college football. And not only that, remember they got to replace both coordinators on both sides of the ball.
Yep.
Bill O'Brien leaves for the NFL. Pete Golding leaves for Ole Miss. So you bring in Tommy Rees, who wasn't like a huge splash hire. I know a lot of Alabama fans weren't thrilled with that. You bring in Kevin Steele, who obviously has a lot of uh, continuity and familiarity with Nick Saban, as he's been his uh, defensive coordinator on multiple occasions. But we have no idea right now who's going to be the starting quarterback. Wide receiver last year was a huge question mark, and I don't think they really did too much in the transfer portal or anything like that to ease that concern. And you mentioned on the defensive side of the ball, you think they should be able to figure that out. They do bring, Kool-Aid McKinstry's back. Was one of the best DBs in the SEC. But I just think it is kind of crazy just looking at this. I was like, obviously they've still recruited well. They've got 5 stars and 4 stars everywhere. But right now, there's nobody that's really jumping at the page that's saying, "Oh, this is going to be the next Will Anderson. This is going to be the next Bryce Young." Because even last year, Bryce Young had to do so much for them to win games. When you look at games like Texas A&M, and other games where they just barely were able to win. I don't know if they have that difference maker this year, so it's going to be interesting how this roster really shakes out.
Yeah, it's a three-way quarterback battle right now with Jalen Milroe, who's kind of the most experienced returner. Ty Simpson, a redshirt freshman, former five-star prospect. And then they took a transfer in the spring cycle, right? Tyler Buckner from Notre Dame. I think that raised a lot of eyebrows. Now,
Mm-hmm.
from the reports out of camp, it looks like Buckner is running behind Simpson and Jalen Milroe. And maybe they just wanted depth, and maybe Tyler Buckner saw a chance to play meaningful snaps at Alabama. You lose Jahmyr Gibbs in the backfield. Jace McClellan, really, really good. 829 yards from scrimmage last year. Roydell Williams and Jamarion Miller expected to kind of committee the backfield for Alabama. It's interesting. I was watching the 2019 national championship game last week because I'm just a complete psycho and excited for football to come back. And the backfield that Alabama used in that game was Damian Harris, Josh Jacobs, and Najee Harris. So two first round picks, three future NFL backs. Interesting enough, the wide receivers, Jerry Jeudy, Jalen Waddle, Henry Ruggs. I mean, Alabama had a run, right? Jamison Williams last year, or two years ago, where they were producing elite level wide receivers year in year out, much like Ohio State. It's just not the case this year. No receiver topped 700 yards last year. They brought in Jermaine Burton from Georgia last year. He didn't make a huge impact. Ja'Cory Brooks is also back. They do bring in Malik Benson, who was the number one wide receiver from the junior college ranks. But I think that's probably the biggest question mark on this team, right? You have enough explosiveness on this offense, as we'll get to shortly. LSU's wide receivers look really good. Georgia's wide receivers look really good. Probably the best wide receiver group for Georgia in a while. So A lot of questions for Alabama. A lot of questions for Alabama. Off this defense, you lose, like we mentioned, Will Anderson. You also lose DJ Dale, Byron Young, Eli Ricks, Brian Branch, Jordan Battle. I mean, and again, we're just used to Alabama replenishing this. I think defensively, I don't have a ton of concern about them. I think they kind of let Pete Golding let Pete Golding leave.
Yeah.
You don't really leave Alabama on if they want you to stay, right? They could have paid Pete Golding whatever he wanted. You bring in Kevin Steele, who's got a lot of experience in this conference. One name to look out for is a five-star freshman safety Caleb Downs, who looks really good in camp, and they're pretty high on as well. Lucas, let's get to the schedule for Alabama. Kind of an interesting one this year. The home non-conference games are Middle Tennessee, Texas, week 2, and Chattanooga. They'll go on the road at South Florida in week 3. In the SEC, they'll get Ole Miss, Arkansas, Tennessee, and LSU at home. They'll go on the road at Mississippi State, Texas A&M, Kentucky, and Auburn. So they will draw Tennessee and Kentucky from the East. The over-under at FanDuel is 10.5 wins. The over is plus 148. Under is minus 184. Lucas, where are you going in this for this kind of confusing Crimson Tide team?
This is really, I kind of went back and forth on this because you mentioned that 2019 team, um, or that in 2019, that was the last year they missed the playoff. And the next year they won it with one of the best offenses that we've seen in college football with Mac Jones, who had only started, I think, 2 games prior to coming into that season. So they've never missed the playoff more than 1 year in a row. They've always rebounded. But like I said, I just have question marks because even going into that year, we knew Mac Jones was going to be the guy, and we knew they had studs at wide receiver. And now we still don't know who the guy is. We don't know who their wide receiver is. Maybe this is a throwback Saban year. Maybe they kind of do what Georgia did the last couple of years, and they're just going to play outstanding defense and maybe play the possession game. But I just don't know if you can even win in the SEC with some of these teams in their division doing that. So, as much as it hurts me, I am going to go under and probably immediately regret doing it. But I think 10-2 is just more likely than 11-1 because, like I said, I think this might be a down year for them. But also, I think the West is also extremely strong once again. That there's just a lot more landmines, even in the non-conference. Like I probably pick Texas in that game right now, even though it is in Tuscaloosa. So under for me at 10.5.
If you look at the toss-ups, it's Texas at home, Tennessee and LSU, and then it's at Texas A&M and at Auburn at the end of the year. Who knows what Auburn looks like Thanksgiving weekend? I'm taking the under as well. They went 10-2 last year, and I just don't know how you're better. And I know that might sound foolish, right? We might look back in November and they're hoisting, another division championship, and they're going to Atlanta and they've won the SEC, but I can't in the preseason in good conscience pick it. So I'm going to go under. I'm interested to see what they do at quarterback. I'm interested what they see if they can find some explosiveness on the outside. So both under for Alabama. Boy, that is kind of rough to hear. So all right, let's get to the reigning SEC West champions, the LSU Tigers, 10-4 in Brian Kelly's debut season for LSU. They win the West with a 6-2 conference record before losing to Georgia in the SEC championship game and throttling Purdue in the Citrus Bowl to get to 10 wins. Lucas, I don't think many expected Brian Kelly to win the West in year one. They brought in a lot of transfers, both for last year's team and for this year's team, as I'm sure we'll get to here as we talk about LSU. But they get Jane Daniels back. You get Mason Smith back, who missed most of last season with a torn ACL he got in week 1 against Florida State. Harold Perkins might be the best defensive player in the country. Their linebacker, who was just awesome last year for them. The wide receiver group might be the best in the conference. There's a lot to like about LSU coming into 2023. There are some questions, as we'll get to, some questions in the secondary, some questions at running back, but a lot to like for LSU, a team that should compete in this division for a return trip to Atlanta.
Yeah, I think all the question marks that I had with Alabama were the complete opposite with LSU. You mentioned they've already got their quarterback. Jalen Daniels was really, really good in the second half of the season last year. You mentioned the wide receiving room, with Malik Neighbors coming back, who's one of the best wide receivers in the conference last year, and even just adding on to strengths. You mentioned Harold Perkins. They also went out in the transfer portal and they got Omar Speights, who was one of the best linebackers in the Pac-12 last year at Oregon State, and that defensive front um, will still be one of the I think will be one of the best defensive fronts again this season. They have Makai Wingo is coming back after an All American season. And even Mason Smith, who most of us thought was going to be their best defensive lineman last year, he gets hurt, misses most of the year with an injury. He is back. Also, all the running backs are back as well. Should be a good offensive line. I mean, they had two freshmen starting on the offensive line last year. Those two are both a year better, especially Will Campbell, who I think even as a freshman in the SEC was second team all SEC as their left tackle. So I really, really like this team. They only have, I believe, 4 true road games this year, too. The schedule is tough. Obviously, they start with Florida State early, but like I said, the question marks that I had on Alabama's roster, I just do not feel like I have that on LSU this season, which is kind of scary considering this is only the second year for Brian Kelly.
Yeah, it felt like last year they kind of pieced it together, right? I think they just wanted to be competitive, get to 8 or 9 wins, and they ended up winning the division. Could have gotten to 10-2 in the regular season had they not laid an egg in College Station to end last year. Biggest question mark really is the secondary.
Mm-hmm.
Um, they had a lot of upperclassmen transfers last year, and those are all gone. They bring in Deuce Chestnut from Syracuse, and some depth already. Some concerns are emerging. Denver Harris, the transfer from Texas A&M, might be off the team. He's missing practice, and J.K. Johnson, their transfer from Ohio State, broke his leg. He's out likely for the season, or is going to miss a lot of time. So secondary is my biggest question, especially
Mm-hmm.
that first game against Florida State. I mean, I'm sure we'll talk about it in a couple weeks, but Florida State's receivers are very, very good.
Mm-hmm.
Other than that, though, you're right. The offensive line should be much improved. You started 2 true freshmen who held their own last year in the SEC, and I think they have more depth this year, right? You look at the
Yeah.
wide receiver group, right? Malik Neighbors over 1,000 yards last year. They have Kyron Lacey, Brian Thomas. They bring in Aaron Anderson from Alabama, and a 5-star freshman, Sheldon Sampson. So plenty of explosiveness on the outside. Jane Daniels, I was impressed with how he played last year. I did not think they were going to get that good of play from Jane Daniels, watching him for 3 years at Arizona State, but he was very good last year for them, and I expect he's one of the better players in this conference, right? One of the better quarterbacks, at least. Let's get to the schedule here. Lucas mentioned it. They'll play Florida State in Orlando, a neutral site game. Week 1, the teams played in New Orleans last year. The home non-conference games include Grambling, Army, and Georgia State. Arkansas, Auburn, Florida, and Texas A&M make the trip to Baton Rouge, and like Lucas said, only 4 true road games, all of them in conference. Mississippi State, Ole Miss, Missouri, and Alabama. The Alabama game on October 7th is the last. I'm sorry, on November 4th is their only road game in the last 6 games. So their 6 of their last 7 games are at home, which is a good thing for LSU. The over under at FanDuel is 9.5 wins. Over is -114. Under is -106. I'm going to go over for LSU. I think there's a good chance they go 4-0 in the non-conference. I think they'll be favored to beat Florida State. That's a true toss-up game. It's 2 top 10 teams on a neutral field. I'm really pumped for that. But, even if they lose that one, you've still got one more loss in there. Maybe it's at Alabama, maybe it's at Ole Miss, but I think the schedule sets up favorably. Your other road games besides Alabama are Mississippi State and Ole Miss. You get Texas A&M, Auburn, and Arkansas and Florida at home. I just think 10-2 is very, very realistic. I think 10-2 puts them in position to play for an SEC championship. And I like what Brian Kelly's doing there. I really do.
Yeah, same with me with the over, like you mentioned. Really, kind of only a couple of toss-up games. Even if they lose that opener against Florida State in Orlando, you still have one game in SEC play. Yes, it might get a little bit dicey, but like you mentioned, I just don't think there are, like you mentioned, maybe the only hole on this roster is maybe in their secondary. So that can be worrisome just because we know the type of athletes that play in this conference on the outside. But they could easily make up for it with their strengths at linebacker and the defensive line, getting pressure to the quarterback. So I'm going to be over as